Okay, grade 9. Your homework tonight, in addition to those corrections, were to do questions 1 to 11, I think is what I said. So some of you were having a little bit of difficulty with them. So I'll go over these questions. If you still have further questions tomorrow, just let me know and we can go over it a different way if that would help you. So the first question says to solve the equation. We already talked about the first question. We did it in class, so I won't go over it again. Question 2 says when Ming solved 0.3 g equals 0.8, her value for g was 2.6 repeated. Let's look at that. So what she would have done here, if she had this question, if she was solving for g, she would divide both sides by the coefficient, and 0.8 divided by 0.3 would be 2.666 forever. Okay? And then she said, well, that's g is approximately equal to then 2.7 because she rounded it. And then she checked her solution to make sure it was right by substituting. So she took her original equation, 0.3 g equals 0.8, and she substituted g for 2.7. But when she did so, this ended up being, 0.81 and not what it should be at 0.8. And why did that happen? Well, because she rounded, and that's the easy part. But what could she have done differently instead? And the answer to that is right here. She could have done this differently. Instead of writing a repeating decimal, and this is where it's important that you have the good fraction sense and integer sense. Instead of writing down 2.6 repeating, she could have written down g equals 2 and 2/3. So she could have written the repeating decimal as a fraction because a fraction is more concrete. And then when she double checked her answer, 0.3 times 2 and 2/3, she could then change this, instead of being a decimal, she could change that to be 3/10. Okay, so 3/10 multiplied by 2 and 2/3 should be 8/10, which is what this was over here. So she reconverted it. Instead of using decimals, she's using fractions because she ended up with a repeating decimal. It's easier to work that way. So 3/10 multiplied by, this would be 6, 7, 8, 8 over 3. When you cross-reduce that, you end up with 8/10, which is exactly what you should have got. So I guess the moral of the story, when you have repeating decimals, if you want to check your solution, it's best that you use fraction form if you have a repeating decimal because it's going to give you exact answers. All right. Question 3. The length of Shamika's stride is 0.75 meters. So she went stride, another fancy word for stride for those of you who is a step or a pace, whatever you want to call it. Both Amalia and Gustav were trying to calculate how many strides it would take Shamika to walk 30 meters from her home to the bus stop. Amelia represented the situation as decimal 75 multiplied by the number of paces, or p, will equal 30. Explain her thinking. And Gustav represented the situation with the equation 30 divided by the number of paces being p, will equal decimal 75. That doesn't make sense at all. Does it? I don't think it does, because if he takes... No, Gustav's crazy. Gustav's crazy. So, of course, Amelia is better. So if she took 2 paces, for example, and each pace was this many, she would have walked 1.5 meters, right? But since we don't know how many paces she's going to take, but we know she has to travel 30 meters, this equation makes perfect sense. So we're going to divide by the length of each pace to figure out how many paces she took, and the number of paces she took. Uh-oh, I don't have a calculator. I'll have to use it. Hang on a second. Okay, now I have a calculator. So if I take the calculator and go 30 divided by the length of each pace, I will need to take 40 paces, or she would need to take 40 paces to travel that 30 meters. The next question, question 4, says write the equation that is represented by the model shown. So it says 3 paper clips is equal to 27 cents. So 3 paper clips, and I'm going to use P instead of X. 3 paper clips, the cost of 3 paper clips is equal to 27 cents. So if I divide both sides by 3, the cost of each paper clip will be 9 cents, and therefore each paper clip must have a cost of 9 cents. Question 5 we didn't have to do. Question 6 says solve. So 2v equals negative 5/6. So we'll get a little bit of space here. Let's see if I can extend this a little bit. All right. So 2v equals negative 5/6. So the first thing is I want to figure out how do I get rid of this coefficient, because I want to isolate for v. And we know that we divide both sides by the coefficient. So I'm going to divide this side by 2, but I don't want to do it this way because it looks very confusing. So if I'm going to divide a fraction by 2, I want to actually write it as divided by 2. Or, even better yet, divided by 2 over 1, because we know we're going to use the reciprocal here. So keep the first fraction, change to multiplication, and use the reciprocal of the second fraction is how we do division. Check for cross reduction, I can't. So I multiply my numerators, I multiply my denominators, and I end up with v equals negative 5/12. And that's the solution for v. For the second one, b, we have x divided by 2 equals 2/5. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of that. But instead of multiplying it by 2 this way, I'm physically going to write multiplied by 2, or even better yet, 2 over 1, since we're using fractions. I can't cross reduce, so x is going to equal the product of the numerators, which is 4, and the product of the denominators, which is 5, and x equals 4/5. Now in question C, the difference is you have your coefficient over here. So what I want to get rid of is that. So 4/3, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1 1/4, because multiplying by negative 1 1/4 and dividing by negative 1 1/4 will get rid of it. I'm left with a over here. But dividing by negative 1 1/4 is what I'm going to have to do to 4/3. So I have to divide both sides by negative 1 1/4. So 4/3 stays. I change it to multiplication. I have to use the reciprocal of this mixed fraction. And if you remember before, mixed fractions are best examined when they're improper, because now when I try to do the reciprocal of negative 1 1/4, I'm really going to do the reciprocal of this one, which means when I flip it, I'm going to end up with negative 4/5. All right, I can't cross reduce, so I'm going to multiply my numerators to get 16. I'm going to multiply my denominators to get negative 15. And therefore, a equals negative 16/15. I can put my negative sign wherever I want. I'll put it in front of it, I suppose. Or, since that's improper, negative 1 1/15 equals a. A lot of work on that one. So press pause if you need to copy that. In your last question, question D, we have a coefficient of negative 1 1/2, which means we're multiplying x by negative 1 1/2. So I'm going to divide that by negative 1 1/2 to get rid of it. I'm left with x. I'm going to divide this by negative 1 1/2 to isolate. Now we have a mixed fraction divided by another mixed fraction. In order to solve it, we need to change these to improper. So we're going to divide those, and those are both negative. I'm not going to divide fractions. I'm going to multiply by their reciprocals. I'm going to flip it upside down. Now I know a negative multiplied by negative is a positive, so I really don't even need those symbols anymore. I can, if I wanted to, I could take my eraser and erase them because they don't really impact it anywhere, because I know my answer is going to be positive. Cross reduce if you can. Oops, see daisy. Cross reduce if you can. I'll use red for this one. So 9 over 3, if that was a fraction, that would be the same thing as 3 over 1. 2 over 4 would be 1 over 2, which means I'd end up with x equals 3 over 2, or 1 1/2. Now, if you didn't cross reduce, it's okay. You don't have to cross reduce. And in fact, if you didn't erase those negative signs, that's okay as well. Because once you get to this, negative 9 times negative 2 would be a positive 18. And 4 times 3 is going to be a 12. 18 over 12 is going to be 1 6/12, which is 1 1/2, which is still the same answer as I would have got if I didn't cross reduce. So the answer is x in D is 1 1/2. Okay, question number 7 says 3/5 is equal to x divided by 4. So in order for me to solve number 7, I'm going to multiply both sides by 4. That's the first thing I'm going to do. And I'm going to bring this down here just to make it a little bit easier for me to do. So since I'm multiplying both sides by 4, by doing it over here, I end up with x. But when I multiply this side by 4, I end up with 12 over 5 equals x. Or, since 12 over 5 is an improper fraction, it would be 2 and 2/5 equals x, either one. So I can get rid of this one. 2 and 2/5 equals x when I multiply both sides by 4. In question B, we have 2y equals negative 6/5. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. That's going to get rid of multiplying by 2. I'm going to get y equals whatever negative 6/5 multiplied by the reciprocal of 2, which is a half. That's going to give me negative 6/10, or in lowest terms, negative 3/5. Okay, so all I did was I divided both sides by 2. That's what it looked like. I changed it to multiplication by the reciprocal. When I did that, I ended up with negative 6/10, in lowest terms, negative 3/5. So therefore, y is equal to negative 3/5. In question C, I'll write it down here because I got more space. Negative 7/6 is equal to negative 4/3 n. So again, I'm multiplying n by negative 4/3. So in order to get rid of multiplying by negative 4/3, I want to divide both sides by negative 4/3. That's going to get rid of multiplying and leave with n. Over here, I'm going to divide negative 7/6, divide that by negative 4/3, because whatever I do to one side, I have to do the exact same thing to the other. Keep my first fraction, change to multiplication, use the reciprocal of the second. So negative 4/3 is going to be negative 3/4. If you don't cross reduce, you'd end up with negative 21 over positive negative 24. But I'm going to cross reduce. 3 over 6 is going to be 1 over 2. Now I can't cross reduce anymore. I'm going to end up with negative 7 over negative 8, which is the same thing as a positive 7/8, because a negative divided by a negative is positive. And I'm not going to change it to decimals. I'm just going to keep it 7/8. And that's my answer. If you wanted to keep it a decimal, I think it would be positive 0.875. 875 is your answer for n if you change it to decimal. And your last question of question 7 is a little bit complicated, but not overly, it's not mind-bendingly difficult. Your last one is 2 and 2/3 w is equal to 1 and 1/6. So again, this is a multiplier to w, right? We're multiplying w by 2 and 2/3. So the opposite operation would be divide by 2 and 2/3. That is opposite, leaving me with just w. I'm going to divide this side by 2 and 2/3. Since I'm dealing with mixed fractions, I'm going to change them to improper. And I never divide fractions. I'm always going to keep the first fraction, change to multiplication, and use the reciprocal. Cross reduce 3 over 6 is going to become 1 over 2. Multiply your numerators, you get 7. Multiply your denominators, you get 16ths. W equals 7/16. In question 8, it says solve and check. So here we're going to divide both sides by negative 5.6. X is going to equal whatever 3.5 divided by 5.6 is. I'll grab my calculator. 3.5 divided by 5.6 equals 6.25. So x will equal 0.625. And remember, it's a positive divided by a negative, so I have to make this a negative 0.625. Here I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 2.2 because I want to get rid of dividing by negative 2.2. So e will equal whatever negative 0.75 times 2.2 is. I know a negative times a negative is a positive, so I know it's going to be a positive. I can put it in if I want. And go decimal 75 times 2.2 equals 1.65. So it's a positive 1.65. You don't need to write the positive symbol because we know it's implied. If you didn't write positive 1.65, we know it's implied that it's positive. Question 9, we're going to multiply both sides by 4.1 to get dividing by 4.1 gone. So multiplying both sides by that will give me h equals 3.6 times 4.1. That's going to be 14.76. That's the value for h. And the last one, I'm going to divide both sides by the coefficient to get rid of it. So I'm going to divide both sides by 0.46. And c will equal 1472, 1.6 0.472 divided by 0.46 equals 3.2. So C equals 3.2 or 3.2 equals C. All right, next page. Next page. Question 10, solve and check. So here we require, these are those weird ones. These are the ones we talked about before that are kind of weird. Hang on just one second. Let me get this straightened up here. Let me give it space to work from. Okay, so let's look at this now. So we have A, 10A, negative 5.5 equals 1.1 divided by A. Now these are one of those questions that we said, some of you maybe have done them, some of you haven't. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to multiply both sides by A. Because what we're going to do is get rid of that dividing by A, leave me with 1.1 over here. And that seems weird. Because now we have A multiplied by negative 5.5, which is the same thing as negative 5.5 times A, or acting as a coefficient. When we multiply both sides by A. Now we're going to divide both sides by that 5.5 or negative 5.5. And we're going to get A is equal to 1.1 divided by 5.5. That should equal 0.2. So it's going to be negative 0.2 because a positive divided by negative is a negative. So the first one is negative 0.2. Oh, hang on a second. That didn't work out as well as I thought. I wanted to keep that as is. Go backwards in time. There we go. Okay. B says 4.8 divided by M equals 6.4. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to multiply both sides by M. And we're going to end up with 4.8 equals 6.4 M, or multiplied by M, coefficient. Divide both sides by that 6.4. And M will equal whatever 4.8 divided by 6.4 is, which is 0.75. And that's our answer for that. Okay, go backwards in time so I don't erase my white space. Question 11. Same idea. 2.02 divided by n equals 0.71. Multiply both sides by n. I get 2.02 equals 0.71 n. Divide both sides by the coefficient. And I'm going to take my calculator and go 2.02 divided by 0.71. I get a big long string of numbers. And it says, I think it says round to the nearest hundredth. So when I round to the nearest hundredth, which is your second decimal place right here, it's going to be 2.85. 2.85. So n equals approximately 2.85. Make sure you just use an equal sign with that above it, or if you want, you can use the approximately equal to. Both are okay. We don't really care. We're not that fussy. And the last question, negative 7.8 equals negative 4.3 divided by x. Multiply both sides by x to start. Negative 4.3 will equal negative 7.8x. Divide by negative 7.8. And when I know it's going to be a positive, so I'm going to put x equals, I know it's going to be positive. So 4.3 divided by 7.8. That's not a point. 0.3 divided by 7.8 equals, rounded to the nearest hundredths. That means this one is not going to make this go up. So my answer is going to be 55 hundredths, or 0.55. X equals approximately 0.55.